The rifle was already cold. Nathan Cole had been on the ridge for 3 hours before first light, long enough for the metal to lose every trace of body heat, long enough for the morning frost to settle across the scope housing in a thin, perfect layer that he did not wipe away. He lay still against the rock face with the particular stillness of a man who had stopped fighting the discomfort of the ground beneath him and simply become part of it. His breathing was slow, controlled. Each exhale measured to last exactly 4 seconds, the way he had been taught, the way he had practiced 10,000 times until it stopped being technique and became something closer to instinct. Below him the valley was still dark. He checked the wind by watching the dry grass on 3 separate ridgelines, each at a different elevation, each telling him something slightly different about what the air was doing between his position and the road that curved through the valley floor 11 kilometers to the east. The road where a convoy would eventually appear. The road that led to a conference center that had in the last 72 hours become the only fixed point in a world that had otherwise come completely apart. Cole reached into the chest pocket of his jacket and removed a folded piece of paper. He did not need to unfold it. He knew what it said. He had written it himself in the hospital waiting room the night after, when the chaplain had finally stopped talking and left him alone in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency that still occasionally appeared in his dreams. He held the paper between 2 fingers for a moment, then returned it to his pocket without looking at it. Elliot Mercer. He settled his eye back against the scope and waited. 3 states away and 2 time zones to the east, Sarah Callahan was already at her workbench. She had arrived at the workshop on Fort Carson 40 minutes before the official start of her shift, the same way she arrived every morning, because the 40 minutes before anyone else came through the door were the best 40 minutes of her day. The overhead lights in the weapons maintenance facility took about 90 seconds to reach full brightness after she hit the switch, and she used those 90 seconds to hang her jacket on the hook inside the door, pull on her work gloves, and run her eyes across the bench surface she had left organized the night before. Everything exactly where she had placed it. Everything accounted for. She was 34 years old and had spent 8 of those years in this building or ones exactly like it, and in all that time she had developed the kind of relationship with her work that most people only managed with other people. She understood weapons the way a musician understands an instrument, not just the mechanics, not just the function, but the particular personality of each individual system, the way a barrel behaved differently at temperature extremes, the way a specific trigger group would develop microscopic wear patterns that told you something about the shooter who had used it if you knew how to look. Her father had taught her that. Earl Callahan had run a gunsmith shop in Sheridan, Wyoming for 31 years, and before Sarah could read, she could identify the components of a bolt-action rifle by touch alone. He was not a sentimental man, her father, but he had one belief he repeated often enough that it had become something permanent inside her, the kind of thing you carry so long it stops feeling like something someone told you and starts feeling like something you always knew. A weapon is a promise, he used to say. You build it right, and it will not fail the person depending on it. He had died when she was 22, 6 weeks before the Army recruitment letter arrived. She had taken the job partly because of the letter, and partly because staying in Sheridan, with the smell of his workshop everywhere she turned, had become something she could not sustain without breaking in ways she was not prepared to break. 8 years later, she did not think about Sheridan very often. She did not think about much beyond the work. She was 40 minutes into the disassembly of a suppressor that had come back from a special operations unit with a baffle stack that someone had clearly pushed well past its rated round count when the door opened without a knock. She did not look up immediately. Logistics officers knocked. Commanding officers knocked. The only people who came through that door without knocking were people who had decided the usual social protocols did not apply to them. And in her experience, that category contained exactly 2 types. People who outranked almost everyone else in the building, or people who were carrying something they needed her to see before they had time to think too carefully about showing it. She finished removing the final baffle section, set it on the cloth to her left, and looked up. The man in her doorway was in his late 40s, with the kind of face that had spent serious time outdoors in conditions that were not recreational. His eyes moved across her workshop the way a person's eyes move across unfamiliar terrain, cataloging, assessing, finding the exits and the shadows and the points of interest, without appearing to do any of those things deliberately. "Major Garrett Briggs," he said. "Special Operations Training Division." Sarah set down her tool. "I know who you are." Briggs closed the door behind him. "Then you know I don't make social calls." He crossed to the bench without being invited and placed a folder on the surface beside her work cloth. He did not open it immediately. He looked at her for a moment in a way that suggested he was deciding something, and then he asked the question that would, though she did not know this yet, reorganize every assumption she had built her life around. "Do you believe a confirmed kill shot is possible from 3,800 meters?" The number landed in the room and stayed there. Sarah's first reaction was not disbelief. It was the involuntary response of a technical mind encountering a problem it wants to immediately begin solving, and she had to consciously redirect that instinct toward the more important question, which was why a man like Garrett Briggs was standing in her workshop at 6:40 in the morning asking it. "That's not a training question," she said. "No." She held his gaze. "Then say what you actually came here to say." Briggs opened the folder and slid a photograph across the bench toward her. It was a high-resolution image of a precision sniper rifle taken from multiple angles, with close-up inserts, highlighting specific areas of the chassis and barrel assembly. The kind of documentation you produced when you were trying to identify something. Sarah looked at the photograph, and then she felt something happen in her chest that she did not have an immediate name for, a sensation somewhere between recognition and freefall, because the rifle in the photograph was not unfamiliar to her. The barrel fluting was a 6-groove helical pattern cut at 14 degrees of rotation, a specification she had developed herself over 3 years of testing because the standard patterns produced harmonic resonance at extreme ranges that introduced variants she found unacceptable. The scope mount carried a deliberate 0.3 MOA offset to the left, a compensation for a strong side dominant shooter with exceptional trigger discipline. The trigger assembly showed modifications to the pivot geometry that reduced travel distance by almost a third without compromising the safety sear engagement. She had built this rifle, not assembled it from standard components. Built it in the specific meaning of the word that her father had used, which meant making choices at every stage that reflected a complete understanding of what the weapon was ultimately for and who would ultimately hold it. The object in that photograph was in the most accurate technical sense her work. When she asked, and her voice came out more controlled than she felt. 6 months ago, the target was Colonel Douglas Fenn. Single shot confirmed, kill location classified. Our analysts initially rejected the distance estimate as a measurement error. They ran it 3 times. Sarah's hand was resting on the bench surface beside the photograph. She became aware that her fingers had curled slightly inward. "It wasn't a measurement error," she said. "No, it was not." She understood the mathematics of what she was being told with a clarity that was almost painful. A bullet traveling 3,800 meters is in the air for approximately 4.2 seconds. In that time, it drops more than 60 meters from the original line of sight, meaning the shooter must aim not at the target, but at a point in the sky 60 meters above it, and trust completely in calculations that have been made in advance and cannot be adjusted once the trigger is pressed. The bullet rotates along its axis due to the barrel rifling, and that rotation causes it to drift laterally, an effect that compounds over distance until at extreme range it becomes significant enough to shift the point of impact by a body width or more. The Earth itself rotates beneath the bullet's trajectory during the 4+ seconds of flight, requiring a Coriolis correction that most professional snipers never train for because it is considered a theoretical concern at practical ranges. She thought about these things not because she needed to convince herself the shot was real, but because running the numbers was how she processed the fact that someone had made it. Someone had stood or lain at a distance of 3,800 meters and calmly worked through every one of those calculations, and trusted them, and pulled the trigger, and been right. She turned away from the photograph and walked to the far end of the bench where she kept her atmospheric reference tables. She began pulling them without asking permission, cross-referencing air density charts against the elevation data. Briggs had mentioned running the math in her head the way she always did, quickly, and without writing it down, the numbers arranging themselves in the particular way that meant they were correct. 40.3 meters of drop compensation at sea level, she said more to herself than to him. Add altitude differential, adjust for temperature gradient across the distance, account for the Lapua ballistic coefficient of the matched ammunition I would have specified for that trigger weight. She stopped. Someone built that specific configuration from the ground up with one engagement in mind. Yes, that's why I'm here. Sarah turned back to face him. Because it was my work. Because whoever did this knew enough to use a weapon built the way I build weapons, which means the ballistic signature points back to this workshop. Briggs looked at her steadily. Professionally speaking, your fingerprints are on the entire situation. She felt something cold and specific move through her. Not fear exactly, more the sensation of a floor that had seemed solid revealing itself to be something thinner. 8 years of careful, invisible work. 8 years of fixing weapons and sending them back into the world and deliberately not asking where they went or what they did when they got there. And here was the cost of that choice arriving in the form of a photograph on her workbench. She did not say any of this. She turned back to her atmospheric tables and kept working. She was still awake at 3:17 in the morning. The kitchen table was covered in printouts, ballistic charts, atmospheric condition records for the approximate date and region Briggs had referenced without naming specifically. Elevation profiles. Her laptop was open to a trajectory modeling program she had written herself 6 years ago to solve a variance problem that the standard Army software was not sophisticated enough to address. She had been running the same calculation for the past 2 hours, approaching it from different directions, checking it against different reference sets, because some part of her had apparently decided that if she could demonstrate the shot was impossible, after all, the photograph on her workbench would somehow be less real than it currently felt. The shot was not impossible. That was the answer she kept arriving at. Not impossible. Simply beyond the reach of any shooter who had not internalized ballistics at a level that eliminated the gap between calculation and instinct. The person who made this shot did not compute their corrections and then execute. They felt them. The way a musician who has played a piece 10,000 times stops reading the notes and simply plays. She was staring at the screen, watching the modeled trajectory arc from an elevated firing position down toward a target at the far end of its range when the thought arrived. Quiet and unwelcome the way the most important thoughts usually are. She had taught someone almost everything that required. Not formally, not in a classroom with a curriculum and objectives written on a board. In her workshop across a counter in the course of a conversation she had not thought about since the day it happened, because at the time it had seemed like nothing more than a technically curious soldier asking questions that were slightly beyond the standard training scope. She had answered those questions completely. She answered every question completely. It was her job and her nature, and she had never once considered that information about extreme-range wind compensation or cold bore accuracy at altitude, or the specific relationship between trigger geometry and shooter fatigue at extended engagement distances might be something other than professional education. She picked up the phone and called Briggs before she had decided she was going to. He answered on the second ring. "I need the personnel logs," she said. "Everyone who came through this workshop in the past year. Not just names. Dates times what they asked, what I told them." There was a pause. "That's a substantial request." "There was someone here," she said, "about 7 months ago, asking questions about extreme-range ballistics that I now understand were not theoretical. I answered every single one of them. I need to know who that was." Another pause. Longer this time. "Then I'll have the logs ready at 0600. Get some sleep." She looked at the papers covering her table, at the trajectory arc still moving on her laptop screen, at the 317 glowing on her phone. "I'll be there at 5:30, she said. She was. The personnel logs covered 14 months and ran to nearly 300 pages when printed, and Sarah moved through them, standing up the stack on the corner of Briggs's desk, her coffee untouched and going cold. Most of it was exactly what she expected. Maintenance requests, scope calibrations, pre-deployment weapon checks, the ordinary traffic of a busy installation where people came through her door because they had a mechanical problem they needed solved and left when it was solved, and neither she nor they gave the interaction much more thought than that. She was in the second 100 pages when she found it. The entry was dated 7 months and 3 days ago. The name in the field was listed as a maintenance consultation, which was a category broad enough to cover almost anything. But the request detail column, which was usually 1 or 2 words, contained a full paragraph in the notation box that she recognized as her own handwriting, because she was the one who maintained these logs and occasionally added notes when a consultation was unusually technical or took longer than expected. She had written extended discussion, re-extreme long-range engagement variables, wind behavior in complex mountain terrain, cold bore accuracy optimization at sub-zero ambient temperature, Scope 0 verification for extended distance shooting. High-value round economy for long-duration operation without resupply. She had answered every question. She could still remember the conversation in fragments now that she was looking at the record of it, the way memories work when something contextualizes them retroactively. A quiet man. Not young, but carrying himself young the way people do who have spent time in environments that required absolute physical competence. He had asked his questions with the focused specificity of someone who was not gathering general knowledge, but solving a specific problem. She had thought nothing of it. People came to her with specific problems all the time. She looked at the name in the field, Sergeant Nathan Cole. She looked up at Briggs. He was already watching her. Cole, she said. Briggs nodded once. 27 years old. Ohio. Recruited into the sniper program out of basic training. His instructors called him the best they had seen in 20 years. What happened to him? Briggs reached across the desk and opened a second folder. He placed it in front of her without speaking and let her read. Corporal Elliot Mercer, 25 years old. Asheville, North Carolina. Assigned as Cole's spotter from their first joint deployment. By every account in the file, the kind of pairing that trained together long enough to develop something that looked from the outside like a single intelligence operating from two bodies. The mission report was classified at a level that meant Briggs had gone through channels to get it here, and the language in it had been carefully sanitized to remove the kind of specificity that would allow anyone reading it to understand exactly how badly things had gone wrong. But Sarah had read enough operational reports to read between the language, and what she understood was this Colonel Douglas Fenn had approved an intelligence package that flagged a location as a staging area for a high-value target. The approval had gone through faster than protocol required, fast enough that verification steps had been skipped because there was a promotion board convening in 3 weeks, and Fenn needed a result to put in front of it. Cole and Mercer were deployed to an overwatch position 2 kilometers from the location. The ground team moved in on their confirmation. The intelligence was wrong. The location was not a staging area. It was residential housing that had been misidentified through a cascade of analytical failures that the report described as a communications breakdown, and that Sarah, reading it, understood as something considerably more deliberate. Things fell apart in the way that things fall apart when someone has made a catastrophic error under time pressure. Mercer took a round pushing Cole out of a firing position he should not have been exposed to. Cole called for extraction at 14:23. The extraction was delayed twice. Mercer died at 14:58, 41 minutes. Cole filed a formal complaint 7 days later. It was closed in 6 weeks. He filed again, closed again, filed again, closed. Filed a fourth time with additional documentation he had gathered himself over 4 months' testimony from other members of the unit, communication records he had obtained through channels she did not want to speculate about. Closed. Insufficient evidence. Communications breakdown, no individual culpability identified. Fenn was promoted 8 weeks after Mercer's death. Cole disappeared from every military tracking system 2 weeks after the promotion ceremony. And 7 months ago, he walked through her workshop door and asked her to teach him the things he still needed to know. She closed the folder. The thing she felt was not simple, and she did not try to make it simple. It was anger and grief and a very specific kind of shame that comes from understanding that you were used without being lied to. That someone had been completely honest about what they were asking while being completely silent about why. And underneath all of that, steady and unwelcome and impossible to ignore, was the recognition that she was the person most responsible for what had happened next. Not Briggs, not the Army, not even Cole, not entirely. She had built the weapon. She had completed the education. She had done both without asking a single question about where either of them were going. There's more, Briggs said. He placed a third item on the desk. A topographical map of a mountain range in western Montana printed at a scale that showed individual ridgelines. A red marker pulsed at a point on the eastern face of a ridge that ran north to south across the upper third of the map. Satellite picked that up 3 days ago, Briggs said. Thermal activity. Consistent with someone who has been up there long enough to establish a concealed position. Sarah looked at the marked point, then traced the distance to the valley below it, to the road that curved through that valley, to the building that sat at the end of that road. 11 kilometers to the conference facility, she said. Yes. She moved her finger to the ridge's western face, to a Mamda marked at higher elevation. calculated the angle to the conference facility's main entrance. 4,000 meters from that outcrop, she said. To the front entrance. Briggs nodded. General Arthur Stokes is scheduled to speak at a 3-day military leadership conference that begins in 4 days. Stokes signed the closure order on Cole's 4th complaint. His signature is on the final report, dated 6 weeks after Mercer died. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then Cole isn't finished. He's been up there for at least 3 days, building his position carefully. The way someone builds something they intend to get exactly right. The radio on Briggs's desk crackled. A brief burst of signal encrypted lasting less than 4 seconds. The duty officer at the monitoring station down the hall came on the intercom 10 seconds after it ended. "Sir, we just received a transmission on the monitored band. Short duration, untraceable. The content was, 'If they want me to listen, send Callahan.'" The room held very still for a moment. Sarah looked at the map at the pulsing red marker on the Montana ridgeline at the distance between that point and the outcrop where a man she had met once and partially educated was lying in the cold with a rifle she had built. She thought about her father's definition of a promise. She thought about 41 minutes. "I'll go," she said. Briggs looked at her carefully. "I need to be clear about what that means. No tactical gear, no visible communications equipment, alone." "I understand. If he raises that rifle at any point, the response team has 4 seconds. I understand that too." She looked at him steadily. "But I'm going to need something from you before I leave." He waited. "If Cole comes down that mountain," she said, "if he agrees to testify, if he puts himself in front of a court and tells the truth about everything I need to know, that testimony reaches the Inspector General's office before Stokes has any opportunity to classify it or bury it or make it disappear the way 4 previous complaints disappeared. Because I am not going to ask that man to trust a system that has already failed him 4 times unless I have something more than a verbal assurance that this time will be different." Briggs was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was taking the question seriously rather than preparing a reassuring non-answer. "I'll make that happen," he said. Sarah picked up the map and looked at the ridgeline one more time, fixing the topography in her mind, the way she fixed ballistic data precisely and permanently. She had spent 8 years building things and not asking where they went. That was finished now. The flight to Montana took 3 hours, and Sarah spent most of it looking out the window at nothing in particular while running numbers in her head that had nothing to do with ballistics. She was thinking about the conversation 7 months ago. Not the content of it, she had already reconstructed that completely in Briggs's office, but the texture of it. The way Cole had stood at her counter with his questions written down in a small notebook, the kind with a hard cover that field personnel used because it survived weather. The way he had listened to her answers without interrupting, without the impatient body language of someone waiting for information they planned to misuse. He had listened the way a craftsman listens to another craftsman with complete attention and evident respect. And she had responded to that the way she always responded to it, which was to give him everything she had. She had never asked his name. She had pulled it from the log, but she had never asked it at the time because names were not the point in those conversations. The work was the point. She wondered what Elliot Mercer had been like. The transport landed at a small military airstrip in the early evening, and within 40 minutes, she was standing inside the mobile command center that Briggs's team had established in a valley 3 kilometers from the base of the mountain range. The structure was a large canvas and aluminum frame heated against the October cold, with a floor covered in equipment cases and folding tables that held monitors displaying feeds from multiple drone systems, running silent observation patterns above the ridgeline. Captain Renee Dalton met her at the entrance. Dalton was 39 with close-cropped dark hair and the particular economy of movement that came from years of operating in environments where unnecessary motion was a liability. She looked Sarah over once, not unfriendly but not warm, the way a surgeon looks at new equipment before deciding whether to trust it. "Callahan," Dalton said. "I run the tactical response team on this operation." Sarah shook her hand. "How long has he been up there?" "Best estimate 4 days, possibly 5. He moves in patterns we can't fully predict, which means our thermal positioning is approximate rather than precise." She gestured toward the monitor bank. "We have a general sector, not a confirmed location. What are the response scenarios? Dalton walked her to the topographical table, a three-dimensional relief print of the mountain range that allowed for accurate distance and angle estimation. She picked up a laser pointer and indicated three separate approach vectors. Alpha Team can reach the eastern face from below the tree line in approximately 22 minutes from current position. Problem is the final 200 meters, which is open rock with no cover. If he's watching his perimeter and he is there exposed, Briggs said. Beta option is aerial insertion on the far side of the ridge, but rotor noise carries 3 kilometers in these conditions, and he'd have 90 seconds of warning minimum. That's more than enough for a man with his skill set to either engage or vanish. Dalton paused. The third option maintains current position and waits for him to move to the primary firing location, at which point we have a confirmed target for a direct response. Which ends with Cole dead and Stokes alive and everything buried, Sarah said. Dalton looked at her without changing expression. That's why you're here instead of option 3. What's his firing timeline? If Stokes arrives in 4 days, Cole would want his position fully established at least 48 hours before the engagement window, which means he's either already in place or will be within the next 12 hours. After that, we lose the ability to approach without him being in a situation where he feels he has to make a decision. Sarah looked at the relief map at the marked sector on the eastern ridge face, at the distance between that sector and the outcrop on the western side where the geometry worked out to 4,000 meters. He's not in the firing position yet, she said. He's staging, moving supplies up in stages to avoid a consistent thermal signature. That's why your imaging is diffuse. Dalton studied her for a moment. You know how he thinks. I know how someone thinks when they're building toward a precision engagement at extreme range. It's a specific kind of patience. Everything in sequence. Nothing rushed. She paused. He'll move to the final position when he's satisfied with every variable he can control in advance. How long does that give us? 12 hours, Sarah said. Maybe 16. After that, the window closes. Then you go up at first light. Dalton began detailing the communication protocol, the hidden microphone sewn into the collar of the civilian jacket Sarah would wear, the monitoring frequency, the response threshold that would trigger tactical deployment. Sarah listened completely and asked 3 technical questions about the transmission range and the response team's staging position relative to the outcrop. Dalton answered all 3 directly and without condescension, which raised her estimation of the woman considerably. As the briefing concluded, Briggs appeared at her shoulder and drew her aside toward a corner of the command center where the background noise of radio traffic and equipment hum provided a degree of privacy. There's something else you need to know before tomorrow, he said. Something that wasn't in the file I showed you this morning. He produced a single printed page and handed it to her. It was a communication log. Internal military system formatted in the standard timestamp and sender notation she recognized from a dozen different official documents. But across the top of the page, someone had stamped "Recovered Backup Archive" in red, and below the original entries, there was a notation indicating the primary record had been modified after the fact. Sarah read it carefully. The original timestamp showed a message sent 18 hours before Cole and Mercer's mission was deployed. An intelligence analyst 3 levels below Fenn in the chain had flagged the target location data as requiring additional source verification. The flag was routine, the kind of procedural caution that was supposed to trigger a hold on deployment authorization until the underlying source could be confirmed. The flag had been seen. That was documented in the backup record. It had been forwarded up the chain, and there was a read confirmation attached to it that carried Fenn's authentication signature, which meant Fenn had opened and read the flag 18 hours before he signed the deployment authorization. He had deployed them anyway. And then, in the weeks after Mercer's death, when Cole's complaints began arriving and an investigation was opened, the primary record had been altered. The timestamp on the flag had been moved forward by 22 hours, placing it after the deployment authorization, rather than before it, making it appear as though the caution had been raised too late to affect the decision, rather than being actively disregarded. The alteration carried a different authentication signature, General Arthur Stokes. Sarah held the page and did not speak for a moment. Fenn didn't make a mistake, she said finally. He made a choice, and Stokes helped him hide it. Yes. And Cole's 4 complaints were closed because anyone who investigated them seriously would have found this. Yes. She handed the page back to Briggs. He needs to know about this. I know. Not as leverage, not as a reason to stand down. He needs to know because he spent 8 months believing the system failed him through incompetence and negligence, and that's not what happened. What happened was deliberate. And there's a difference between a system that's broken and a system that was actively weaponized against him. He deserves to know which one he was actually fighting. Briggs looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Then he folded the page and put it back in his jacket. "Tell him yourself," he said. "Tomorrow." She did not sleep well. The cot in the temporary quarters they had set up for her was adequate, and the exhaustion was real, but the mind does not always cooperate with the body's requirements, and hers spent most of the night moving between Cole's personnel file and the recovered timestamp, and the topographical relief of the mountain she would climb in a few hours. She was dressed and at the command center entrance at 5:15. Dalton ran the final equipment check personally. The microphone was a flat disc the size of a shirt button sewn behind the top buttonhole of the jacket collar with a wire so fine it was invisible against the fabric. Transmission range was 800 meters in clear conditions, less in complex terrain, which meant once Sarah was above the tree line and moving through the rock fields, there would be gaps in the signal. Dalton had positioned a relay unit at the tree line to reduce the dead zones, but she was honest about the fact that it was imperfect. "No vest," Dalton said. "No visible equipment of any kind. If he's watching your approach and assume he is anything that reads tactical, ends this before it starts." "Understood. 4-second response window if he raises the weapon. That's the physics of the distance in the terrain. I want you to understand that number clearly." "I understand it." Dalton looked at her steadily for a moment, then nodded once. Sarah started up the trail as the sky began to lighten in the east. Not sunrise yet, just the first gray suggestion of it above the distant peaks, enough to see by if you moved carefully. The lower section of the trail was packed dirt through open timber, the kind of walking that required attention but not effort. And she moved through it at a pace that was sustainable without being aggressive, because 40 minutes of hard climbing at altitude would leave her breathing audibly when she arrived, and she needed to be able to speak normally. She needed every variable she could control to be in her favor. The timber thinned at around 1,800 meters and gave way to the rock fields, which were exactly as difficult as the topographical map had suggested. Loose shale on steeper sections, some of it shifting under weight in ways that required her to choose each step, deliberately testing before committing. She went down on one knee once, catching herself with both hands on a stable outcrop, and felt the cold of the rock through her gloves. Continued. She was thinking about what to say. Or more precisely, she was thinking about what not to say, which felt like the more important discipline. There were things that would be true and still wrong. The practiced language of de-escalation she had heard referenced in the briefings, the carefully constructed phrases designed to create a sense of connection while steering the subject toward a predetermined outcome. She had no training in that and no interest in it. Cole would hear that kind of language immediately. She was certain of it. What she had instead was the truth in all its inconvenient complexity, and she had already decided that was what she would offer him. She reached the upper rock field and moved through it carefully, staying low, not because anyone had instructed her to, but because the terrain was exposed and the wind had picked up at elevation, and she needed to preserve her footing. The outcrop that the topographical map had marked as the most likely firing position was visible now, a long flat shelf of rock on the western face of the ridge, oriented toward the valley below. Wide enough for a man and his equipment, shielded on 3 sides by natural rock formations. She stopped at the edge of the open approach to the outcrop. A figure was kneeling beside a rifle mounted on a bipod, looking down into the valley through a spotting scope. He had not turned around. "You came alone," Cole said. His voice was rougher than she expected the voice of someone who had not spoken much in recent months. "You asked for that." "I did." He did not move from the scope immediately. "I didn't think they'd actually agree to it." Sarah stepped fully onto the outcrop and moved to a flat rock about 3 meters from his position. She sat down without being invited, looked at the rifle. It was the weapon from the photograph. She could see that immediately. But it was not the weapon from the photograph, not entirely because someone had continued working on it in the months since she had last touched it. The trigger group had been replaced entirely with a custom assembly she did not recognize but could assess from its visible geometry. The scope was a different unit, higher magnification with turret markings that suggested it had been calibrated to a specific ballistic curve she would have liked to work out on paper. "You rebuilt the trigger," she said. Cole finally turned and looked at her. He was younger than she had been imagining during the flight, which she found oddly affecting. 27 years old, in a face that had recently absorbed something that aged a person well beyond 27. His eyes were steady and dark and carried the particular quality of someone who had made a decision and stopped being uncertain about it, which in her experience was sometimes a relief and sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world. "You recognize the work," he said. "I recognize what you changed. The geometry on the SEAR engagement is different. Shorter reset. 3 months of filing and testing." He paused. "You'd probably do it differently. I'd have started from a different blank. But the principle is sound." He studied her for a moment. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Something almost imperceptible. A fractional relaxation of attention that had been held so long it had become invisible. "You're the only person they've sent," he said, "who hasn't looked at me like I'm a problem to be solved." She met his eyes. "You are a problem to be solved. But that's not all you are." He was quiet for a moment. "Then why did you come? The real reason, not the operational one." Sarah considered the question. "Because I built that rifle without asking what it was for. And I answered your questions without asking why you were asking. And somewhere in the gap between those two decisions, Elliot Mercer's death became part of what I'm responsible for." She paused. "I came because I needed to look at that directly. And because there's something you don't know yet that you should." His expression sharpened slightly. "What?" She told him about the recovered timestamp. She laid it out in the same sequence she had processed it herself, starting with the flag raised by the analyst, moving through the read confirmation on Finn's authentication, arriving at Stokes's alteration of the primary record. She did not editorialize. She gave him the facts in the order they occurred. When she finished, Cole was very still. He knew, Cole said. Finn knew before he signed the deployment authorization. He chose the timeline because he needed the result before the promotion board. Cole's jaw tightened. He looked down at the rifle, then back at her. "I filed 4 complaints. I gave them testimony, documentation, communication records. They closed it 4 times. Because Stokes was altering the records as the complaints came in. Every time you provided evidence that pointed toward the timing. The timing had already been adjusted in the official system to make your evidence look wrong. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a person absorbing something that confirms what they already believed while simultaneously making it worse. You came up here to tell me that," Cole said finally, "not to talk me down, to tell me that." "I came to do both," Sarah said. "But not in that order." He looked at her. She continued, "What you did to Finn, I'm not going to tell you. It was just, I don't know enough about justice to make that claim. But I can tell you that the reason you came to my workshop 7 months ago and asked those questions, and the reason you're on this mountain right now, has nothing to do with the kind of man you were before any of this happened. I read your file. I know what your instructor said about you. I know what the people who trained alongside you said. And I know what Elliot Mercer's personnel file says about the two of you together." Cole's expression changed. "Not much, just enough. He talked about a fishing shop," Cole said. His voice had changed too. Something in it had come loose in a way that was not weakness, but was something adjacent to it, something that looked like what happens when a person stops holding a very heavy thing perfectly still. He had the name picked out. The lake, the town, what he was going to charge for half-day rentals. He talked about it for 40 minutes while I was... He stopped. "While you were keeping him alive," Sarah said quietly. Cole looked away from her toward the valley below. She let him look. She did not try to fill the silence or redirect it or use it. She just let it exist because some silences are doing necessary work, and the worst thing you can do is interrupt them. After a while, he said, "Stokes signed the closure order on my 4th complaint, 6 weeks after Elliot died." "Yes." "He knew about the timestamp alteration. He signed off on it. The evidence indicates that clearly." Cole was quiet again. "Then, you said there's something he doesn't know." "Stokes." Sarah looked at him. "Yes." "What, that you're here? That you have a witness who has already communicated to a superior officer that Cole is prepared to testify?" That the recovered timestamp document is already outside the chain of command that Stokes controls. She paused. He knows there's a threat on this mountain. He doesn't know the threat has already changed shape. Cole turned back to look at her fully. His eyes moved across her face with the same precision he applied to everything else, reading her the way he read wind, looking for inconsistency, for the tell of a scripted response. He found none. Because there was none. If I go down that mountain, he said. If I testify. What happens to the 15 years I spent becoming the best at something I will never be allowed to do again? Sarah held his gaze. I don't know. I can't tell you that ends well. What I can tell you is that Elliot Mercer's name appears once in the official record of what happened to him in a casualty report that attributes his death to hostile action in a classified location. No mention of the intelligence failure, no mention of Fenn's timeline, no mention of the 4 complaints or the altered records. She paused. If you testify, his name appears in a very different kind of document. The kind that doesn't get classified. The kind his family can actually read. Cole was very still. Then the radio in Sarah's collar crackled. Dalton's voice came through, clipped and urgent. Callahan, change in situation. Stokes's convoy just departed the airport. He moved his arrival up. ETA to the conference facility is now 20 minutes. The world on the outcrop shifted in an instant. Cole's entire bearing changed. 8 months of trained preparation overriding everything else, the grief, the conversation, the fragile progress of the last 20 minutes, all of it receding as his body moved toward the rifle with the automatic certainty of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment 10,000 times. Sarah stood. Nathan, she said. His hand was on the rifle's stock. The timestamp, she said. It only matters if there's someone alive to confirm it. You go down that mountain breathing that document destroys Stokes in open court. You put a bullet in him from 4,000 meters, he dies a general, and the document gets classified inside a week, and Elliot Mercer's name stays in a casualty report that nobody reads. Cole's hand did not move, but he did not raise the weapon. 30 seconds, Dalton said in her ear. Sarah took 1 step toward him. Not aggressive, not tactical, simply closer. The hardest shot you will ever take, she said, is the one you choose not to. Cole looked at her. His hand was still on the rifle. The valley below was empty. The convoy was not yet visible. There were exactly enough seconds left for this to go in either direction. And then Cole's hand lifted away from the stock. He straightened up from his kneeling position and with a single deliberate movement pushed the rifle sideways along the rock surface away from his reach, the metal scraping across stone with a sound that carried down the mountainside in the cold morning air. He stood with his hands open at his sides and looked out at the valley. Tell them, he said. Tell them I'm coming down. Sarah raised her hand to her collar. Dalton, she said. Weapon is clear. Cole is descending voluntarily. Hold all teams at current position. We're coming down together. A pause. Then Dalton, controlled but unmistakably relieved, copy that. Teams holding. Come down slow. Sarah looked at Cole. He was still watching the valley, his profile sharp against the pale morning sky, his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who has put down something very heavy and is not yet sure what his hands are for. Let's go, she said. He nodded once. They started down the mountain. They had been walking for 6 minutes, moving carefully through the upper rock field when Dalton's voice came back on the channel. The relief was gone from it. Callahan. New problem. Stokes's convoy has stopped short of the facility entrance. He's requesting a private situation briefing, and he's asking that no formal documentation be generated until he has personally reviewed the circumstances of this operation. Sarah kept walking. Beside her, Cole had heard it too because the change in his bearing was immediate and recognizable. He's going to try to contain this, Cole said quietly. He's done it before. Sarah did not answer immediately. She was looking down at the command center visible in the valley below, at the vehicles arranged around it, at the figure she could already identify from this distance as Garrett Briggs standing at the entrance. She stopped walking. Cole stopped beside her. She reached up to her collar. This is Sarah Callahan, she said, making sure her voice was level and clear. I am requesting that the following statement be logged across all active command channels and confirmed as received by multiple independent parties. Sergeant Nathan Cole has voluntarily surrendered his weapon and agreed to provide full testimony regarding the death of Corporal Elliot Mercer, the intelligence failure that preceded it, and the subsequent alteration of official records by Colonel Douglas Fenn and General Arthur Stokes. I am formally requesting that this testimony be recorded and transmitted to the Inspector General's office before any custody transfer or operational debriefing takes place. She lowered her hand. The channel was quiet for 2 seconds. Then Briggs's voice, careful and deliberate. Request acknowledged and logged across all active channels. Documentation initiated. Then from a different voice, she did not recognize someone in the command structure closer to Stokes. Callahan, this matter involves classified operational details. Authorization for that kind of transmission requires... It's already transmitted, Sarah said. She started walking again. Beside her, Cole looked at her with an expression she would think about for a long time afterward. Not gratitude, exactly. Something more complicated than that. The expression of a man who had spent 8 months trusting nothing and had just cautiously extended that trust one more time towards something he could not fully control. The command center was 3 kilometers below them. They walked toward it together. The command center felt smaller when they walked into it. Not physically. The canvas walls and aluminum frame had not changed in the hours since Sarah had left before dawn. But the atmosphere inside had compressed into something dense and pressurized, the kind of air that exists in rooms where people are trying very hard to control situations that are no longer fully controllable. General Arthur Stokes was standing at the center of it. He was 57 years old and carried himself the way men carry themselves when 3 decades of institutional authority have become indistinguishable from their own identity. Silver-haired, straight-backed, with the kind of composure that looked effortless because it had been practiced so long it had become structural. 2 aides flanked him at a slight distance. Dalton's tactical team occupied the perimeter of the space with the careful neutrality of people who had been given no clear orders about what the next 5 minutes required of them. Stokes looked at Cole first. The assessment was quick and professional, the way a general looks at a threat, measuring capability and intent in a single pass. Then he looked at Sarah, and his expression shifted by a fraction, recalibrating for a variable he had not fully accounted for. He spoke to Briggs. "Major, I want Sergeant Cole processed through standard military custody protocol immediately, and I want a communications hold on this operation until I've had the opportunity to review exactly what has been transmitted in the last 30 minutes. Briggs was standing at the far table with a tablet in his hand. "Sir, Sergeant Cole has agreed to provide testimony regarding the circumstances surrounding the death of Corporal Elliot Mercer. That intention has already been logged and transmitted per the request made by Ms. Callahan during descent. The documentation is outside this command channel." Stokes's expression did not change visibly, but something behind it did. A very small tightening, the kind that comes from a man who has just understood that the room he walked into was not arranged the way he expected it to be. "Ms. Callahan," he said, turning to her with the particular deliberateness of someone choosing their next move carefully. "I understand you played a significant role in bringing Sergeant Cole down from that ridge, and I want to be clear that is appreciated. However, you are a civilian contractor without operational authority in this matter, and the transmissions you initiated during your descent were made without proper authorization. I'll need those communications reviewed and potentially reclassified before..." "The timestamp," Cole said. Everyone in the room looked at him. He had not raised his voice. He had not changed his posture. He simply spoke with the same quiet precision he applied to everything, and the 2 words landed in the room with a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Stokes turned to him slowly. "You modified the official record," Cole continued. "After my 3rd complaint, the flag on the intelligence package was time-stamped 18 hours before Fenn signed the deployment authorization. You moved it 22 hours forward in the primary system to make it look like the caution came too late to matter." He paused. The backup archive still had the original. Stokes was very still. "Those are serious allegations, Sergeant, and this is not the appropriate venue for..." Dalton stepped forward. She placed her tablet on the table between Stokes and Cole and turned the screen to face the general. Sir, my team documented Sergeant Cole's radio transmissions during this operation, which include direct reference to the intelligence timeline and the record modification. That documentation is part of an active operational file that has been transmitted per the request logged 40 minutes ago. She paused. I would strongly advise that any further discussion of this matter occur in the presence of legal counsel and Inspector General representation. The room was quiet. Sarah was watching Stokes. She had been watching him since they walked in because she understood, in the way she understood complex mechanical systems, that the most important information was usually carried in the small movements, the micro adjustments that people made when what they had prepared for turned out not to be what they were facing. What she saw in Stokes was not the clean surface of a man with nothing to hide. It was the surface of a man who had hidden things for long enough that the effort of hiding them had become part of his resting expression, and who was now doing the rapid internal arithmetic of someone calculating whether the architecture of concealment he had built over 8 months was still structurally sound. She could see that it wasn't, and she could see that he was beginning to understand that too. Sir, she said. He looked at her. I built the weapon Sergeant Cole used in the engagement 6 months ago. I provided the technical education that made the shot possible. My professional involvement in this situation is as direct as anyone's in this room. She kept her voice level and factual. What I can also tell you is that the recovered timestamp document, the backup archive record showing the original flag placement 18 hours before deployment, authorization is currently in the possession of the Inspector General's office. It was transmitted there as part of the documentation request I logged during descent. It is not in this command channel. It is not something that can be reclassified from this room. Stokes looked at her for a long moment. The thing she noticed was that he did not deny it. He was a man of considerable intelligence and long experience, and he understood, as she understood, that there was a threshold past which denial was not only futile, but actively damaging. She could see him cross that threshold in real time, a barely perceptible shift in his bearing, a slight release of tension that looked almost like relief, the way it sometimes does in people who have been carrying something very heavy and have finally reached the point where putting it down is the only option that makes any sense. He turned away from her and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. I want to speak with the Inspector General's office, he said. His voice had changed. Not broken, not defeated, but different in a way that was difficult to name. Quieter, more careful. The voice of a man who had decided the game he had been playing was over and was beginning to think about what came after. That can be arranged immediately, Briggs said. I'd like legal counsel present. Also arrangeable. Briggs was already moving toward the communications equipment. Sarah looked at Cole. He was watching Stokes with an expression that was not satisfaction. She had expected something closer to satisfaction, and the absence of it told her something important. What she saw instead was exhaustion, and beneath it something that might eventually become peace but was not peace yet. Only the preliminary clearing of ground where peace might eventually find a place to stand. He caught her looking and held her gaze for a moment. She nodded once. He nodded back. The formal proceedings that followed were not quick. They were not supposed to be. The Inspector General's office dispatched a team within 18 hours. The communications hold Stokes had attempted to establish was reversed by the IG's authority within the first hour of their involvement, and the documentation that had accumulated in the operational file, Cole's radio transmissions, Dalton's team logs, Sarah's formal statement made during descent, and the recovered timestamp from the backup archive was absorbed into what became a federal investigation that would occupy a significant portion of the military justice system for the next several months. Sarah stayed in Montana for 6 days. She spent most of those days at a folding table in the command center, working through the technical documentation that the IG investigators needed to understand what the weapon represented and what the shot it had made possible actually required. She produced a 40-page analysis of the rifle's construction modification history and ballistic capabilities, written in language precise enough to satisfy the technical requirements of a legal proceeding and clear enough to be understood by people whose expertise was law rather than engineering. She wrote about barrel harmonics and the specific way the custom fluting pattern she had developed affected resonance frequencies at temperature extremes. She wrote about the trigger geometry Cole had modified and what that modification indicated about the level of skill and patience required to implement it correctly. She wrote about the atmospheric conditions on the day of Fenn's death, the wind patterns, the temperature gradient, the probability calculations that would have been required to place a round on a target at that range under those conditions. She wrote it all down completely and without omission because the truth of what Cole had done technically was inseparable from the truth of what the system had done to him, and both of those truths needed to be in the record. On the fourth day, Briggs sat down across from her at the folding table while she was working. "You know, this documentation is going to be used in the case against him too," he said. "Not accusatory, just factual. I know. You're building the prosecution's technical evidence as carefully as you're building the IG case." "Yes," she said. She did not look up from the page she was annotating. "Because the truth doesn't get to be selective. What Cole did to Finn was real, and it was deliberate, and it's in this record the same way everything else is." She paused. "The system failing him doesn't erase what he chose, and what he chose doesn't erase what the system did. Both things get to be true at the same time." Briggs was quiet for a moment. "Then, you've changed." She looked up at that. "You came in here 2 weeks ago as someone who had spent 8 years making sure nothing that happened outside her workshop was her responsibility." He said it without judgment. "And now you're sitting here voluntarily building a document that may put the man you just talked off a mountain into a prison cell for a significant portion of his remaining life." "Yes," she said. "And that's all right with you." She set her pen down. "It's not all right. None of this is all right. Elliot Mercer is dead. Cole is going to spend years in a military prison. Finn is already dead. Stokes' career is finished. None of that is all right, and none of it gets better just because the truth is finally on paper." She paused. "But the truth being on paper is still better than it not being on paper. And someone had to put it there." Briggs nodded slowly. He looked at the stack of documentation she had produced, 40 pages of precise technical analysis that would outlast every person in the room. "Your father would have understood this," he said. She thought about that for a moment. The shop in Sheridan, the smell of gun oil and wood shavings, the particular way Earl Callahan held a rifle he was working on, with the reverence of someone who understood that objects made with care carried that care forward into whatever they were eventually used for. "He understood that a weapon is a promise," she said. "He just never told me the promise cuts both ways." The court-martial proceedings against Cole were conducted 3 weeks after the events in Montana. Sarah drove to the military facility in Virginia, where the preliminary hearing was held, and sat in the gallery behind the low wooden barrier that separated observers from the court. The room was smaller than she had expected, the architecture of military justice more compressed and functional than the civilian courthouses she had seen in photographs. Fluorescent lighting, wood-paneled walls that had absorbed decades of difficult conversations. Cole stood when the charge was read. Premeditated murder, the deliberate killing of Colonel Douglas Finn. The legal language was precise and without context, which was, she understood exactly what legal language was designed to be. Context was what the proceedings would establish, or try to. His defense counsel entered the recovered timestamp and the IG investigation findings into evidence. The prosecution entered Sarah's technical analysis, the same document used by both sides because the same document contained both the proof of extraordinary skill and the proof of the institutional failure that had preceded its application, and you could not separate them cleanly no matter how hard you tried. The presiding judge was a woman in her early 60s with the careful expression of someone who had spent a long career trying to apply consistent principles to situations that consistently refused to be consistent. She read every document submitted. She asked specific questions. She took 3 recesses during the preliminary proceedings that ran across 2 full days. The sentence was 15 years. Substantially reduced from the initial prosecution recommendation, the judge stated, in recognition of documented and deliberate institutional failure that materially contributed to the defendant's actions, including falsification of official military records, willful suppression of legitimate complaint proceedings, and the premeditated disregard of intelligence verification protocols that directly caused the death of Corporal Elliot Mercer. She paused before she delivered the final portion. "This court wants to be clear," she said, "that reduction in sentence does not constitute a finding that the defendant's actions were justified. Sergeant Cole made a deliberate choice that resulted in the death of a fellow officer. That choice carries consequences that cannot be resolved by the circumstances preceding it, however serious those circumstances were. What those circumstances do affect is the measure of those consequences and the record in which they exist. Cole stood and received it without moving. No reaction visible in his posture, no change in his expression. Sarah had been watching him for 2 days, and she had come to understand that his stillness was not absence of feeling, but its containment. The same discipline that allowed a person to hold a crosshair steady at extreme range applied now to holding himself steady inside a courtroom where the mathematics of his life were being recalculated by strangers. After the session concluded and the gallery was cleared, Sarah was permitted a brief meeting in a room off the main corridor. A guard stood near the door. The room had 2 chairs and a table and a window with reinforced glass that looked out onto a concrete courtyard. Cole sat across from her. He looked tired in the way that people look tired when the thing they have been preparing for has finally happened, and the preparation is no longer required. 15 years, she said. He nodded. She did not offer comfort immediately. She had learned in the weeks since Montana that offering comfort before someone was ready to receive it was a form of impatience, and she owed this man better than impatience. After a moment, he said, "The judge mentioned Elliot by name. In the official record." "Yes." He was quiet for a little longer. "Then, that's something." "It is," she said. "His family will see that. They will." He looked at the window, at the concrete courtyard beyond it, plain and gray and offering nothing in particular. She watched him look at it. "I spent 8 months becoming one thing," he said. "I don't entirely know what I am now." She thought about how to answer that honestly. "You're the person who chose to come down from that mountain," she said. "That's not nothing. That's probably the hardest thing you've ever done, and I think you know that, and I think on some level Elliot would have known it too." Cole was quiet for a long time after that. When the meeting ended and the guard indicated the time was up, Cole stood and looked at her across the table. "Thank you," he said. "Not for saving me, for telling me the truth about the timestamp before anything else, for coming up that mountain to give me real information instead of just talking me down." She nodded. He was taken back through the door on the left. She left through the door on the right. 6 months after the Montana operation, Sarah Callahan sat before the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee in a room that was considerably larger than the military courtroom in Virginia, with cameras along one wall, and an audience that included people whose names she recognized from news coverage of the Stokes investigation. She had not sought the testimony. The subcommittee had requested it specifically because the IG investigation had generated findings that the committee wanted to understand in concrete terms rather than bureaucratic language, and her technical analysis, which had by that point been entered into 3 separate proceedings, had established her as the person most capable of explaining what a weapons technician's work meant in the larger context of institutional accountability. She sat at the witness table with a glass of water she did not touch and a microphone she had tested before the session began. The subcommittee chair was a senator from Pennsylvania, a man in his late 60s who had spent 20 years on the committee and asked his questions with the directness of someone who had heard enough indirect answers to last several lifetimes. "Ms. Callahan," he said, "you have described your role in this situation as that of someone who provided technical capability without asking what that capability would be used for. Can you explain to this committee what that means in practical terms and why it matters for the reforms this committee is considering?" Sarah looked at him. She had prepared for this question, not the words of the answer, but the honesty of it. "For 8 years, she said, I believed that my responsibility ended when a weapon left my workshop. I calibrated scopes and repaired trigger assemblies and built modifications that made precision systems more precise, and I told myself that whatever happened after the handoff belonged to someone else's ledger. My job was the object. What the object did in the world was not my job." She paused. "Sergeant Cole came to my workshop 7 months before the events in Montana. He asked me questions about extreme-range ballistics that I answered completely because they were technically legitimate questions, and it was my professional habit to answer technically legitimate questions completely. I did not ask him why he wanted to know. I did not ask who he was or what he was building toward. I gave him the final pieces of an education that he then applied with extraordinary skill to kill a man." The room was very quiet. That is the practical meaning of what I did, she continued. And it matters for the reforms you are considering because the failure is not only at the level of generals who falsify records or colonels who disregard intelligence flags. The failure runs all the way down to technicians who treat their work as complete the moment it leaves their hands. Systems do not fail only at the top. They fail at every level where someone has decided that the consequences of their actions belong to someone else. The senator wrote something down. Then, you have also advocated strongly for the specific reforms proposed in the IG's report. Can you tell the committee which of those reforms you consider most critical? The verification requirement, she said without hesitation. The proposal requiring independent confirmation of intelligence from a second analytical chain before deployment authorization can be signed. Not a procedural checkbox. A genuine independent review with its own documentation trail that cannot be modified by anyone in the original authorization chain. That requirement, if it had existed when Corporal Mercer's mission was deployed, would have caught the unverified flag before the deployment was authorized. It is the single change most likely to prevent what happened to him from happening to someone else. She paused. Everything else matters. The protected complaint channels matter. The mandatory IG involvement in any intelligence-linked casualty investigation matters, but the verification requirement is the one that stops the casualty from happening in the first place. The session ran for 3 hours. She answered every question directly, including the ones that were designed to complicate the picture, to suggest that Cole's actions had made reform less likely, rather than more to imply that the narrative of institutional failure was being used to obscure the narrative of individual violence. She acknowledged those tensions without resolving them artificially because they were real tensions, and the committee deserved real engagement with them rather than a cleaned-up version that served a particular conclusion. When it was over, she walked out of the building into the November air of Washington and stood on the steps for a moment, letting the cold settle against her face. Briggs was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He had driven down from Fort Carson, which she had not expected. "You didn't have to come," she said. "No," he agreed. He fell into step beside her as she moved down the steps. "How did it go?" "They asked good questions." "Did you give good answers?" She thought about it. "I gave honest ones. Whether they were good depends on what they do with them." They walked to the end of the block and stopped at a corner waiting for the light. "Have you heard from him?" Briggs asked. "Cole. A letter," she said. 2 weeks ago. He's been assigned to the prison's vocational program. He's teaching basic mechanics to other inmates." She paused. "He said it turns out explaining how things work to people who genuinely want to understand is something he's surprisingly good at." Briggs made a sound that might have been a laugh, quiet and brief. "Sounds right." The light changed. They crossed. She thought about Elliot Mercer's family, about the letter she had written to his mother 3 months ago, formal at first and then in the second draft, honest, explaining what her son's death had eventually uncovered and what it had changed, which was not enough and was also not nothing. She had received a reply, 2 handwritten pages that she had read 4 times and kept in the drawer of her desk at the workshop. She thought about the judge's voice reading Elliot's name into the official record in that small Virginia courtroom. She thought about the conversation 7 months ago, the one she had answered completely and without question, and about what it would have meant if she had asked one question then. Not to prevent what Cole had become, because she understood now that his path had been set before he ever walked through her door, but to know. To be present in her own work in a way that went beyond the mechanical. She could not change that, but she could change what came after. She was back at Fort Carson by the following afternoon. The workshop was exactly as she had left it, which she found obscurely comforting in a way she did not fully examine. The overhead lights took 90 seconds to reach full brightness. She hung her jacket on the hook inside the door. She pulled on her work gloves. There was a maintenance request on her bench from the previous day. A scope calibration for a unit scheduled to deploy in 3 weeks. Routine work, the kind she had done hundreds of times, the kind she could do largely without conscious attention because her hands knew the steps. She was 40 minutes into it when the door opened. A young soldier, mid-20s, with the careful posture of someone who had been told this workshop required a certain kind of behavior and was taking that seriously. He held a rifle case in both hands. "Ma'am, I was told you could help with a 0 verification. Long range. I'm having some consistency issues at distance." Sarah set down her calibration tool. She looked at him for a moment, taking in the case, his rank insignia, the unit patch on his shoulder. "What range are you working at?" she asked. 800 meters, he said. "Sometimes further, depending on the mission profile." She nodded, set the case on the bench. "Before we open that," she said, "I'd like you to tell me a little about what you're working on. The mission context, what you're trying to accomplish." He looked slightly surprised. "It's standard long range." "I understand it's standard," she said, not unkindly. "I just find that I do better work when I understand what the work is for." She met his eyes. "Takes about 5 minutes. Humor me." The soldier set the case down and began to explain. Sarah listened. It was in the end exactly what it appeared to be. A routine calibration for a routine deployment. Nothing hidden in the questions, nothing loaded in the request. Just a young soldier with a scope issue and a deployment timeline and a genuine need for the kind of help she was uniquely qualified to provide. She opened the case and began her assessment. The work itself had not changed. The tools were the same. The process was the same. The particular satisfaction of bringing a precision system into perfect alignment of solving the exact problem that existed in the space between what a weapon was currently doing and what it was capable of doing, that was the same too. But something in the space around the work was different now. She had asked, and that she had come to understand was the promise she owed to the work and to everyone it eventually touched. Not omniscience, not the ability to prevent every consequence. Just the willingness to be present in her own choices, to understand that the thing she built and the hands it passed into and the world it operated in were all part of a single continuous responsibility that did not end at the edge of her workbench. Her father had told her that a weapon was a promise. He had been right. He just had not had occasion to explain that the promise belonged to the builder as much as the bearer, that it traveled forward through every pair of hands the object passed through, that it arrived eventually at consequences that carried her fingerprints, whether she had been paying attention or not. She finished the calibration in 40 minutes, handed the rifle back to the soldier with a written record of the adjustments she had made and a clear explanation of what had been causing the consistency issue at distance. He thanked her and left. Sarah stood at the workbench for a moment after the door closed in the particular quiet of the workshop in the minutes before anyone else arrived. The smell of gun oil, the fluorescent hum, the tools laid out exactly as she had left them. She picked up the next request from the stack. She got to work.